Thanks very much, Deborah. Thank you very much for having me here. Thank you, Angela, for that great setup. I feel really privileged to be here and to get to talk to you all at the start of your pathways to progress the solar industry in the US. I've sort of been around the Sunshot Initiative since it started back in 2010, and I'm blown away by that deck and how much progress there has been and so many programs, many of which some of the companies and initiatives I'm involved with have benefited from. So thanks to the DOE and to the organizers today. As was said, I'll try to leave you with some big picture, sort of high-level context for the work you're about to do the next few days, and maybe challenge you a little bit about how we can dig in and even do more. My background is as the founder of Sungevity. I guess that's why I'm here. I still work there mostly on international business. We're the US's largest privately held solar service business. We're also in Europe in a big way with E.ON largely, which makes for an interesting bedfellow, the largest utility in the world. But as was mentioned, I also helped start the SunCube, which is in Oakland, California, an incubator and accelerator for solar startups. John Powers is a resident there, and there's about 20 other companies, 5 of whom I think are Sunshot awardees. And we have hackathons, and the DOE actually supported one a few weekends ago, and lots of incentive competitions and things to keep inspiring and trying to start up new solar entrepreneurial efforts. I write a lot about this stuff, and while this is not a blog site, it's a pretty cool place to go if you want to just be uplifted about the industry you're engaging with and getting involved with. This I call the Solar Ascent, but basically it logs all the good news stories, which are many, and it's just a fun place to scroll through international media accounts of all the amazing progress which our industry is making hand over fist around the globe. And you can also follow me on Twitter if you so care. I should declare I'm on the board of the Solar Foundation, which is one of the participants as a team here with the Civic PACE program. That's a wonderful organization I'm proud to be a director of because we do the solar job census that I'll talk a bit about in the next 10-15 minutes. And I'm also on the board of Vote Solar, which many of you would know as kind of like one of the kick-ass campaigning organizations, works with the like of RAP and IREC and others to drive the state policy making that's necessary to keep the solar train moving, which is what I'm going to talk to you about. So, the background that we're all coming into as players in this industry, as fast and furious as it is really something that was written 30, 40, 50 years ago with the invention of the basic technology set. And in my lifetime, it's fallen in price, the silicon chip, the silicon cell, much as the silicon chip fell in price in my lifetime as well, due to a learning curve from manufacturing. Every doubling of volume has led to this thing that we now call in places Swanson's law. It's a bit like Moore's law. It's not exactly the same, don't worry, I'm not making that claim. Nor is Moore's law really as rigid as people attribute it, actually. Moore himself just said in a paper in the 60s that the increased efficiency and reduction in price and size of silicon semiconductor microprocessors is likely to continue. That was the law. And so it has been that semiconductor known as the silicon cell has come down in price and become more efficient through mass manufacturing and doubling in volume. 18% with every doubling has been the historic learning curve. And that is an amazing phenomenon that means that we now sell solar modules that were 70 bucks a watt when I was born-ish to 70 cents a watt today, and they continue to go down. And that has created enormous markets. I love these two slides, actually. That was about 2 years ago in The Economist. The headline, you'll note. This is 2 weeks ago in The Economist. Same headline. I love it when I catch the sub-editors at places like The Economist being boring. So it is a sunny outlook nonetheless. Maybe they're just right. Massive growth in markets. We heard about the growth here in the United States, and it's happening around the world. In fact, it's happening faster outside these borders, even though we invented that silicon-based semiconductor known as the solar panel and solar cell here in the US. It's now moving faster elsewhere. For example, the Chinese this year are on track to do about 17, 18 gigawatts this year of installations of solar. They did 5 in the first quarter. We'll probably do 6 or 7 this year in the country. So there are countries that are beating us, shall we say, in this race. But it's all good because we need it everywhere. It's led to this cost curve, which we'll see in a few different representations in a minute. But it basically, when combined with the same kind of learning curve through manufacturing of storage of different chemistries of different types, means that we have a very different electricity system. And really, at the end of the day, the business you're all entering is not solar, it's electricity. And that is being disrupted this decade in a way that the electricity markets have not changed in 100 years. So that's one of the big themes that you've got to get used to. Hold on to your hats. You're jumping on a solar coaster. The change is going to be fast and hard and never ending. And if you're not up for that, if you don't zoom with the times, if you want a relaxing job or a gig in a team that's going to do something pretty calm and peaceful, this is not for you. This is going to be, crazy ride, lots of, heartfelt moments, maybe some vomit in your mouth, the whole deal of emotional experiences as you go through the solar coaster. But because of you, we will continue to drive these curves south. And that's the key thing. We've looked at the cost of the cell and the module, but what's really important is the installed system costs at different scales in different markets and segments. And that's why Sunshot was such a critical intervention by the US government to get the price down here, not just of the thing, but the way the thing is deployed. Because as was mentioned, if it was 0 cents per kilowatt hour for cells and modules, we'd still be paying for red tape, for deployment, for cost of capital, for acquisition costs, for all the different elements that make up the price of solar for the end users in different markets. But the good news is the curve applies, and the more we engage your genius, your best efforts, the entrepreneurs of America, we can do this. And to Obama's wish, we will do this. I just love throwing this slide up here for an audience that may be relatively new to the space, so forgive me if this is redundant, but it was from an analyst late last year in November at Bernstein, which is one of Wall Street shops, well known and respected. That's the price of solar streaking in like Deus Ex Machina from the sky, right, in recent history. And that's the price of other forms of electricity generating and energy through other markets, the Henry Hub and various other measures of energy price per BTU, the British Thermal Unit. The point is just how dramatic this disruption really is to those markets and how we are actually dissecting 100 years of wealth and power, which has accreted through time through the opposite phenomenon to a manufacturing learning curve, which rules and governs our industry, which is a scarcity curve. Fossil fuels necessarily become more expensive through time because they are finite. The more you use them, the more expensive they become. That has been the history of electricity to date, because the more we've used them to boil water largely, the more expensive electricity has become. That's all you've ever known in your lifetimes, is electricity actually going up. Whereas what we're driving is a curve which will take electricity cost down. And that is a wild change in the paradigm of electricity service provision, so much so that this analyst called it, as you note, welcome to the Terradome. And I just love that, because for his audience of people who have made their wealth and power from 100 years of selling fossil fuels to boil water, to build steam heads, to drive electricity turbines, this is the Terradome. This is all of that at risk. This is that disruption that Napster was to the music industry, that Airbnb is to Hilton hotels, that Uber is to the taxi industry. It's going in the streak of a lightning bolt to change everything about how we do electricity. And I know that sounds dramatic, but when we're talking about 10 years from now, 15 years from now, as far as electricity goes, that's lightning pace. These industries have not changed for 100 years. These regulated monopolies in America, these technology sets, the incumbent technology is basically the same as it has been, and now it will be completely changed. And so for many involved, it is a Terradome. And to me, that's an exciting thing, because why I'm here is actually trying to spread solar to slow climate change. But spread it we are, spread it we will, and succeed we're definitely doing. Again, just to give you what that learning curve, that cost reduction has driven, is a massive growth. Sungevity started in 2007. So talk about solar coaster. Our company has kind of beaten the CAGR that was mentioned, the compounded annual growth rate, doubling every year at least. That's a hard thing to do, to maintain a culture, to keep your head on, to keep your cash flows in the right order. This is an S-curve akin to, you will have heard this analogy before, cell phone adoption in the 1990s, we're just at the point where you remember your first friend who got a cell phone. Do you remember that person? Who remembers anyone with a landline? Who here has a landline? I love doing this. Every time I do this, the numbers are less and less. That is what we are probably going to see with this stuff. In the US, it's been a great news story. Just last year, it was a remarkable thing. And what blows me away is how distributed generation is really maintaining its pace of growth as a piece of this, which I know a lot of the teams here are going to be working around. You know, we deployed more solar power in the United States last year than coal was installed to the grid, and wind was installed. So only gas beat us. That's why I call it the solar ascent. This curve, economists call the S-curve. It's just the beginning. We haven't got to the steep bit yet. That's the key point. We've begun. We will have a decade or two of very steep growth, and then we'll find a plateau where we've broadly saturated the market, and that's when billions of people who don't even have electricity today on Earth get it, and the many billions of us that take it for granted have it through new means largely, and then we will sort of level off. But that's a pretty amazing ride to be joining. Don't take it for granted from me, take it from fact that this is a successful process underway in a way that I don't think most people realize, certainly not mainstream commentators. I use this graph just to describe the history of electricity supply in the 21st century. This is a graph of capacity, not supply, not electrons in the grid, but rather the new additions that go into the grid, which is an important difference and key, but the lag phase you'll understand and be able to project forward. The point here is that had you done this graph for the 20th century, the red line would have been 80% and above for 100 years, right? Coal, oil, nukes, and gas would have been everything. Every year where electricity was installed in the world, it would have been a steam boiler pretty much. In the 50s, we started adding steam boilers using radiation rather than burning stuff to get the steam head. We did a bit of wind late in the century, but broadly speaking, blue would have been very low, red would have been high, if not higher than it was in 2000. And then the world kind of made a choice, and we don't actually acknowledge this. It's one of those weird subconscious things we did, but we started to phase the red stuff out. Every year since 2000, we have put in less new dirty energy than clean. Less new dirty energy, and then in 2012, the lines crossed. And it's really funny for those of us that have been around the solar industry, as many of you have, 2012 was the bad year, if you remember. Solyndra, for example, you know, the attempt at a whipping boy to beat Obama at the electoral politics for having backed the DOE to do the sunshot and all the rest of it, the solar loans and guarantee program. The number of companies that went out the door backwards that year, the bankruptcies in Europe, a range of difficulties which I couldn't, bore you with. But the weird thing was that was actually our greatest hour. That was the year in which wind, solar, and other clean technologies became more of new additions to the global grid than the coal, oil, nukes, and gas content being added to the grid did. And thereafter, it has been so, which is a pretty amazing thought. And again, perhaps I'm being redundant and telling you stuff you know, and I beg your forgiveness if I am. But I don't think the world realizes we're on this path. We are now doing more clean every year than dirty. And other people are saying it too. I love this slide. It's Al Gore at Davos in January, basically making the same point, but to the World Economic Forum, so he's putting it in terms of money. And showing that the money flows, whereas they used to all be on the dirty side of the ledger, coal, oil, nukes, and gas, flipped in the last few years and are now increasingly on our side of the ledger and growing, and that delta becomes bigger and bigger yearly. Actually, by some figures, we've been doing more on clean energy for 7 years, but I think that includes a nukes analysis, which I don't really share. But point being, we are now building out in the global grid clean energy at scale. I tend to talk globally, and all the much of the work I do is in emerging markets, partly because while the great work you're doing is sort of rewiring the existing 100-year-old grid of America, which is obviously the first amongst many, It's about 900 plus gigawatts in capacity around the country. We'll probably rejigger some percentage of that, a couple hundred gigawatts if we're lucky in the next couple of decades. But in the meantime, during that same period, some countries will build similar scale grids, or some continents at least. So, the Chinese, for example, last December, when President Xi stood up with President Obama to make some climate commitments, President Xi said, we'll build 1,000 gigawatts of wind and solar by 2030. 1,000 gigawatts is more than the entire US electricity capacity in wind and solar capacity in 15 years. What sort of took us 150 since experimentation began to get to where we are. So they'll do that in 15. Africa will do something twice as big, probably. So the good news here is that we are building out clean energy at scale, as I said, and en masse, and in a remarkably, historically rapid pace. And it creates jobs. It was mentioned in some of the DOE content, and all the things that I've read in the packet about your team efforts are amazing for what they will do for your communities in terms of workforce development. This is a global figure again, but I think really relevant is the work that Vote Solar does with the National Job Census, which shows that the solar industry today is now a bigger employer in America than the coal industry. Just wrap your heads around that for a second. We're more important in terms of employing people and feeding families with a paycheck than the coal industry. Do we feel like that? Do we show up like that in Congress and in the state houses where electricity is regulated? Do we go there and say, give us what is ours, which is the industry's right to be able to have access to the grid to sell our service, to get our customers because they want it, because it's cheaper, because it's better? We don't. We show up like cap in hand kids who are still begging for the next thing. We're the job creators in America. This number has grown by 100,000 out of the Great Recession. The coal industry has shed jobs during that period and will continue to shed jobs for all time, basically, until it is phased out. The oil and gas industry, likewise. Don't believe the hype about a boom in jobs in Dakota. First, how many jobs were there? And secondly, how many are gone now, with 50% of fracking companies going bankrupt this year, with Schlumberger laying off 9,000 employees in one instance? These jobs are good jobs, like Obama said, can't be offshored. The installation occupation alone, the end of our value chain, is larger than the coal mining occupation in America. And remember, we're less than 2% of electricity supplied in America. Coal is 35% of electricity supplied in America. So when we're 10%, when we're 20%, when we're 30%, when we're 50%, which is entirely feasible, technologically and financially, it makes the most sense this century, we will employ hundreds of thousands, if not millions more. And that is a good news story that the politicians are starting to see and realize. Particularly true around the world, because youth unemployment, talk about building out clean energy in Africa, even more important, getting something for kids to do. When your demographic is 50, 60% of the population under the age of 20 today looking for a paycheck, guess which energy system you choose to build out? Not the one which is capital intensive, full of Tonka trucks and big steam boilers and a couple of Homer Simpson guys pushing buttons, but rather the ones that employs people in the community, doing the O&M, doing the installation, doing the sales and finance, creating the business models, the innovation that spreads the stuff at a distributed level throughout the community. This is probably our greatest strength over the economics in the 21st century, and yet it's the thing that we talk the least about. And again, just this year, this was based on polling done by the Solar Foundation of the sort of sentiment and job hiring plans of companies like Sungevity and others. And it was before the oil and gas markets went bust. So we're not just going to do 8 times more, we're going to do many times more job creation in America this year. So it's good news. And the next passage in the history of electricity is even more so, in my view. This is a bit of an eye chart, so forgive me, but basically the pie on the right is kind of existing electricity capacity, so power plants, think of them like that. A couple of years back, but best numbers I could find for you, 5,500 gigawatts on Earth. Bloomberg, who built this bottoms up with an analysis of what's actually permitted, what's being financed, or bonds being issued, think that by 2030, just 15 years from now, there'll be twice as much capacity on Earth. You can debate that. It will be clearly wrong because necessarily forecasts are. This is a mug's game, forecasting electricity growth. One thing that I know from having done it for 20 years as a mug myself is we always get wrong what renewables will do. We always underestimate how fast they will grow. But take this as like a model. I mean, GE, I could have used their graph. They think it'll be slightly bigger. They think it'll be 12,500 gig. But whatever, we're going to more than double the amount of power plant capacity on Earth. Different capacity factors, I'll give you that, different efficiencies in grids and technologies. But the amazing thing is we're going to go from 2% of a small pie to nearly 20% of twice as big a pie. That is, we, the solar industry. That's what you're engaging in. That's what you're setting pathways for. That's what your praxis over the next couple of years is to demonstrate and to do and to lead by example this remarkable yellow slice that you see growing there through time, year on year, bigger and bigger than anything else in the world. The fossil fuel piece will crash. The nuclear piece will largely go away because finance just won't back it. The wind bit will double. The green will get bigger. The demand response on top will get bigger. But solar will 10x in 15 years. We've been at Sungevity for 8. In less than twice the time we've been in a business, our industry is going to do that. It is a crazy, crazy momentum behind us. There's a lot of friction in the system. There's a lot of vested interest and wealth and power, like I said, that doesn't like that picture. But anyone sane that understands electricity markets thinks this is so. And then if you speculate a little and you get excited about electric vehicles and some other things and reinventing fire like our friends at Rocky Mountain Institute do, that story gets bigger faster. So just want to welcome you all to what a wild ride we're in for and what a great time it's going to be. Michael Liebrich, a couple of weeks ago in New York, stood up at a dog and pony show and threw the same kind of stuff up in this slide. Michael Liebrich's from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the founder of it, and a wonderful analyst in his own right, although I don't agree with him with the red in this graph. But anyway, take that as an aside. He boldly called this the beginning of the end. And it evoked for me a moment of panic. And this is where my cautionary tale and my challenge to you: do not rest on that laurel. Do not believe that. I don't know if you know much about the history of the British in the Second World War, but there was a very important battle at El Alamein in Egypt. And until then, basically every time the Tommies had taken on the Germans, they lost. And after then, and you know, we've all watched Benedict Cumberbatch in that movie about Enigma, but there were lots of other things at work as well. After the Battle of El Alamein, pretty much every engagement of substance, the British won against the Germans. And Churchill came to call the Battle of El Alamein not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. And it was a really important distinction to keep the British population on their feet and pushing forward in the fight. And I think that's where we're at. Yes, we've got the wind behind us. Yes, the sun smiles on our face. Yes, we've got economics and technology and job creation as our narrative versus theirs, which is job destruction, economic cost and social cost. You know, the truth of solar in America is we save families money, we create jobs, and we strengthen the grid. That's all she wrote. And we've got all that truth behind us, and we've got this likely future in front of us. But there will be headwinds. There will be political backlashes. There will be people that will come out with sticks in the night and beat you because you're succeeding in what you're doing. And I mean that seriously and challenge you to sort of gird yourself for what is still a struggle in coming years, as good as it gets. And it becomes even more so if we really try to lift our game to be all that we can be. And this is the bit where I want to provoke you to think over the next couple of days, not just about can we get solar panels out there? We can. We've evidenced that. We're doing it. It's not every 4 minutes, Mr. President. It's now every 180 seconds in America. We're booming. There's no other word for the solar industry in America then boom. That is an appropriate description. The challenge really is, will it fulfill its true potential, which is not just to generate electricity that is clean, that's a great benefit, but will it do something which does not reproduce the inequities of the previous energy systems? The previous energy systems, like I said, were written on other people's backs. They were necessarily derived from extractive industries, things that forced people that were unfortunate enough to have oil, coal, and gas or uranium under their feet would be displaced, so that some people could come in with capital and monopolize those resources and then sell them that power to the rest of us through, in this country, monopolies that they were granted by government as well. And we run the risk of reproducing the inequities and injustices of that energy system too in the 21st century, unless we work really hard to architect and design something very different to that in our communities as we begin. I call it 3D energy. Yes, it will be decentralized. That is naturally where the market goes, because that is economically cheaper than building big bloody transmission lines and putting stuff out of sight and out of mind. Selling electricity to California from Nevada, Utah, and Idaho won't cut it in the 21st century with modern machines rather than kettles. But distributed is not enough. Decentralized in terms of ownership and democratized is where I think we should go, where we actually control the resources and we control the electricity supply. And if we can do that, we can fulfill the kind of truly emancipatory, liberating potential that is solar power, to put power in the hands of the people. And so far, so good in the experiment. I'm not disparaging what we've done to date, but I'm just cautioning us as a collective to make sure we keep that goal in mind as we get set on the road to success. The Germans, for example, 35 gigawatts in their small country of 80 million people, have more than 50% of it owned at the community level or the individual level on farms and on homes and on businesses, rather than by either the banks or the utilities. Likewise, as it spreads through Bangladesh, as it spreads around the world at the bottom of the pyramid, most of the models that are succeeding in terms of business innovation are ones which put power in the hands of the community and the people in different ways. So for me, that's very important. And then even more important is, will it be enough in terms of the climate imperative? So this is what motivates me every morning to get up, to go to work at a couple of different companies and be on the boards of many others and all the rest that I do. And it's the fact that we have a very simple moral arc of our times. And it's the carbon emission concentration in the atmosphere. And our task is to bend it south by displacing the dirty energy system that's put the carbon in the sky and building a clean energy system. And this graph simply shows the three markets where Sungevity's operated in: Australia, Europe, and the US. And as you can see, Europe has kind of started to get to where it wants to go because of massive deployments by the likes of the Germans of wind and solar. In fact, you know, to take a moment to share some more good news, last year was the first year in history where global GDP rose by 3%, but emissions stayed flat. We've had flat emission years and even downward emission years in the past, but there have been years of recession or negative or neutral economic growth. Last year was a year of growth with emissions staying flat. We've done it. We've decoupled economic growth from carbon use. The IEA, the International Energy Agency, no friend of our industry, set up by the petrostates to advise governments on how to prolong our addiction to fossil fuels, says quite clearly that the reason that happened in 2014 is because the Chinese and the US were shutting down coal plants and building wind and solar plants. So it's working. The US is back on a better path. The Australians are still screwing around, as they do and will, with this idiot that they've got in the parliament. I can say that, I'm Australian. But where we want to get to are these bands at the end. The tighter, darker green band is really where I think we need to be to preempt 2 degrees centigrade rise in temperatures. The broader band is more like the political consensus target area. And as you can tell, that timeline I was talking about, the next 15 years, that build out of clean energy that Bloomberg projects will more than 10 or 9x solar and all the rest, it's not quite going to get us there. And so the challenge to you all is, how do we do more? To put it in other numbers, we're on path to build about a terawatt of solar and onshore wind, the two competitive, unsubsidized renewable technologies on Earth. 1 terawatt is 1 million megawatts. That's kind of what we think we're about to do in the next decade, by 2025. if you take the IPCC seriously, which I know the US Senate does not, but that doesn't matter because the politicians will follow, as they always do, because the jobs are in it and the money's in it and all the rest of it. So they'll get behind the train, but we should, according to the science, do 2 terawatts by 2025. So we're missing 1 million megawatts. That is what I want you to do, 1 million extra megawatts. And that's why I spend a lot of time these days in this Fun Cube, which Deborah mentioned. It's a space we've created for solar entrepreneurs and startups, something like this, but ongoing. And we support them however we may. We provide lawyers and accountants and brown bag lunches and parties and a social atmosphere, which really, as much as anything, is what will get you through that solar coaster, that ride that you're about to join. Because the hardest part about being an entrepreneur is not, is solar good? Is there an addressable market? Is the value proposition great? It's how do you get money in to build your business? How do you attract investors? How do you do the formation documents for your thing, whatever that is? How do you work out the marketing and customer acquisition piece? All those problems we try to help with on a daily basis, and trying to turn Oakland, which is this photo, into the sort of epicenter of solar entrepreneurialism in the US, but also trying to support an international network of solar entrepreneurs. Because what the world needs now, more than anything, is more of you. Like I said, we're on the right path. It's a pretty amazing story. The history is incredible. The pace of change is unparalleled in industrial history, to my knowledge. We're on a faster adoption curve, according to the UN, than mobile phone technology, actually. So it's going gangbusters, but we've got to do more, and we've got to help you succeed in what you want to do and then replicate you in so many ways. With that, I'll end. Thank you.